Long before printing presses and digital screens, stories walked on two legs. I am talking about the story walkers, the original masters of personalized narrative, whose ancient methods are a secret weapon against our modern world of generic content. By the end of this, you will possess a complete blueprint for making any message you deliver feel deeply personal and unforgettable. We will uncover how a single legend could transform into 21 unique versions, and why the most powerful part of a story was often the silence before it began. What is the one story you wish could be told just for you? That lone figure on the dusty road carried the entire world in their memory. They were a living, breathing response to a fundamental human need, a need that existed long before the written word. In an age without instant messaging or digital archives, these travelers were the vital nodes in a vast, informal network of human connection. They carried more than just tales of gods and heroes. They brought news from distant towns, warnings of shifting political winds, and the latest ballads born in far-off taverns. A story walker was historian, entertainer, news-bearer, and spiritual guide, all woven into a single, itinerant life. Their arrival signaled an event, a collective breath for a village. The day's labor would end, and the community would gather, not around a screen, but around a person. This was not a passive consumption of a fixed text. It was an interaction, a live performance where the story could bend and shift with the energy of the crowd, the glint in an elder's eye, or the whispered question from a child. The story became a mirror held up to the community, allowing them to see their own struggles, their triumphs, and their fears reflected in the grand, timeless patterns of myth. To truly grasp the genius of their methods, we must first appreciate this profound necessity. Their legendary ability to craft 21 versions of a single tale was not a mere party trick. It was the core of their purpose, a sophisticated craft born from the very fabric of their world. The moment a story walker crossed into a new village, their performance was already underway, a silent act of total absorption. They did not announce their purpose or begin their tale. Instead, they would find a place at the edge of the common area, perhaps near the village well or under the shade of a great tree, and they would simply listen. For hours, sometimes for days, they would sit and absorb the life of the community. This was the first and most critical craft, the art of deep listening. It was a form of high-stakes research, conducted not in scrolls but in the raw data of human experience. They tuned their ears to the specific lilt of the local dialect, the nicknames people used, the topics that sparked heated debate or knowing laughter. They noted everything: the state of the fields, the repairs needed on a fence, the way a mother called her child home. The gossip shared while drawing water was not just chatter, it was a map of social alliances and tensions. The concerns voiced by the elders were not just complaints, they were a list of the village's deepest fears and unmet needs. The names of local hills and streams were not just geography, they were clues to the community's history and identity. This empathetic gathering of intelligence was the essential first step. A legend about a stubborn god would fall flat in a village that prided itself on compromise. A tale of a bountiful harvest would feel cruel if the fields were failing. The story walker was collecting the unique emotional and cultural pigments they would use to repaint a universal myth, ensuring it would resonate with a powerful, personal truth. Without this deep listening, any story told would be just a recitation. With it, the story became a revelation, a mirror held up not to humanity in general, but to this specific group of people, in this specific place, at this specific moment in time. This meticulous listening was only the first layer of preparation. With the soul of the village mapped in their mind, the story walker then turned to its voice. A story told in a foreign tongue is a story half heard, a melody played on an out-of-tune instrument. Their second craft was the deliberate and masterful adoption of the local dialect and vernacular. This was far more than a simple translation of words from one language to another. It was a deep dive into the unique rhythm of a place, a conscious choice to weave their narrative with the very slang, proverbs, and grammatical quirks that define daily life there. If the villagers called the north wind the old man's sigh, then the storm god in the legend would speak with that same chilling breath. If there was a local saying about pride coming before a fall, the story walker would have a boastful character utter those exact words. They absorbed the musicality of the local speech, the way sentences were constructed, the particular humor that made people laugh. This linguistic shift was a powerful act of inclusion. By speaking the people's language in its truest, most intimate sense, the story walker dismantled the invisible wall between traveler and villager. The hero's solemn oath would no longer sound like a line from an ancient epic. It would ring with the sincere conviction of a promise a local farmer might make to his neighbor. The villain's cunning threat would carry the distinct, menacing cadence of a rival clan from the next valley over. Suddenly, the myth was no longer a distant fable from a foreign land. It felt native, as if it had been whispered by the local streams and had grown from the very soil upon which the audience stood. This was not deception, it was resonance. By clothing a universal story in the specific, familiar fabric of local speech, the story walker ensured its themes would land not just in the mind, but deep in the heart. Once the story spoke with the local tongue, it needed to walk upon the local earth. With the village's own dialect echoing in the narrative, the story walker performed their third, masterful craft, weaving the very geography of the place into the legend's core. The dragon's lair was no longer a vague, distant peak on a forgotten map. It was the specific, foreboding cliff face just a day's walk to the north, the one everyone knew was treacherous to climb. The magical river where the hero found solace and a guiding spirit was not some fantasy stream. It was the same familiar water that ran past the village mill, where children skipped stones and women washed clothes. This was a deliberate and genius act of relocation. By planting the myth directly into the audience's backyard, the story walker transformed the entire surrounding landscape into a living, breathing stage for the epic. Imagine the powerful shift in perception for the listeners. A tale told in a generic forest is entertaining, but a tale that unfolds in the very woods where you gather firewood, where the shadows you know hide ancient secrets, becomes utterly consuming. Children leaving the gathering could point to a particular hill on the horizon and truly imagine a slumbering giant beneath its soil. They could walk along the stream and half expect to see the glint of a water nymph's gift. This practice did more than just make the story exciting. It fostered a profound and personal connection to the land itself. That gnarled old oak tree was no longer just a tree, it was the wise elder from the founding myth. The strangely shaped rock in the meadow was not just a stone, it was the petrified heart of a betrayed lover. The story walker was, in effect, enchanting the mundane world, imbuing every hill, path, and landmark with a layer of wonder and significance. The village and its environs ceased to be a simple collection of houses and fields. They became a living storybook, a sacred text written not on parchment, but on the earth itself, where the line between daily reality and timeless myth became beautifully, powerfully blurred. But a story rooted in the local landscape was still missing its heart. That heart was the village's own memory, its unique history of triumphs and tragedies. The fourth craft of the story walker was to weave these ancestral threads directly into the grand tapestry of the myth. An astute narrator would learn of the local founder who braved impossible odds, and suddenly, the hero of the ancient legend would bear that very same name. They would hear tales of a great fire or a devastating flood from generations past, and that collective trauma would become the central conflict in the story they told. This was a profound act of validation. By hearing their own history echoed in a timeless epic, the villagers received a powerful message. Their struggles were not insignificant. Their ancestors were not forgotten. Their local saga was itself a chapter in the great human story. The legend became a mirror that reflected not just universal truths, but the specific, proud narrative of that particular community. A tale of a lost love resonated differently when it mirrored the fate of the miller's great-grandparents. A story of a community rebuilding after a dragon's attack felt intensely personal to a village that had literally rebuilt itself after a landslide. This craft transformed the performance from entertainment into a ritual of identity reinforcement. It strengthened communal bonds, reminding everyone present that they were part of a continuous line, that their shared past held heroism and wisdom worthy of legend. The story was no longer just a tale from afar. It was an affirmation of their own place in the world, felt deep in the bone. Yet these living landscapes and ancestral echoes were populated by figures who felt strangely familiar. The fifth and perhaps most daring craft of the story walker was the subtle reshaping of universal character archetypes into local personalities. The wise mentor in the legend was no longer a generic old man with a long beard. He walked with the same slight limp as the village elder, and he offered his advice with the same patient, deliberate tone. The cunning trickster god did not just play pranks. He spoke with the same fast-talking charm and wore a hat tilted at the same jaunty angle as the popular traveling merchant everyone knew. This was not about cruel mockery or creating simple caricatures. It was a profound act of mirroring, a way of saying, the roles in this great cosmic play exist right here among you. The audience would exchange knowing glances, a quiet chuckle rippling through the crowd as they recognized the blacksmith's stubborn pride in the story's fallen warrior, or the healer's gentle resolve in the goddess who mended the broken sky. This instant recognition transformed the story from a spectacle into a personal conversation. When the hero faced a moral dilemma, the villagers were not just observing a distant character's choice. They were seeing a version of their own local leader, or perhaps even a reflection of their own inner struggles, magnified on an epic scale. The lessons of the myth became impossible to dismiss as mere fiction. The consequences of greed, the rewards of courage, the pain of betrayal, these were no longer abstract concepts. They were the lived experiences of the person sitting next to you, now woven into the fate of gods and heroes. By dressing archetypes in local attire, the story walker ensured the story's heart beat in rhythm with the community's own, making every victory feel shared and every warning feel intimately directed. These mirrored characters and their epic struggles were never just for show. They were the setup for the story walker's most delicate and powerful craft, the tailoring of a story's moral heart to mend the village's own hidden fractures. After absorbing the local spirit, language, and history, the narrator would listen for the silence between the words, the unspoken tensions that threatened the community's peace. A story was never a mere distraction from these problems. It was a surgical tool, a form of narrative medicine. The central conflict of a timeless legend could be deftly reshaped to reflect a current, painful reality. In a village simmering with arguments over a shared well, the story walker might choose a legend about two brothers who nearly destroyed their family by fighting over a single, enchanted spring. The tale's climax, where the brothers learn that their survival depends on cooperation, would land with the force of a divine verdict heard by all parties in the dispute. For a community where young adults felt stifled by tradition and elders felt disrespected, the narrator might tell a saga of a headstrong young hero who only succeeds by heeding the forgotten wisdom of his ancestors. The story becomes a bridge, allowing each generation to see its value reflected in the epic, validating the energy of the youth while honoring the experience of the old. This was not a public lecture or a scolding from an outsider. It was a form of guided reflection, a way for the entire community to confront its most difficult issues through the safe, symbolic language of allegory. The story offered a shared perspective, a common ground from which to view a conflict that had previously only bred division. The villagers were not being told what to do. They were being shown a possible path forward, wrapped in the compelling drama of gods and heroes. The narrative became a therapeutic force, a catalyst for conversations that might have been too difficult to start otherwise. In this way, the story walker acted as a subtle mediator, using the ancient power of myth to heal the fresh wounds of the present, ensuring the story did not just live in the mind, but actively worked to rebuild the spirit of the community. After mending the community's spirit with narrative medicine, the story walker would often shift the emotional weather entirely. They knew that the deepest lessons could arrive on the wings of laughter. Laughter may be a universal language, but its true dialect is intensely local. The seventh craft was the masterful, strategic use of humor and local jests. A story walker would have absorbed not just the village's worries, but also its joy, learning the specific rhythm of its comedy. This was not about telling generic jokes. It was about weaving in playful insults that were a sign of affection in that particular community, or having a bumbling god mirror the misadventures of the well-loved, slightly clumsy woodcutter. The mythical beast might be outwitted in a way that perfectly echoed a local folktale about a fox and a fence. A supporting character, perhaps a messenger from the gods, might pause to tell a joke that was currently making the rounds in the village tavern. This bespoke humor did far more than just entertain. Each shared chuckle was a brick in a bridge of camaraderie and trust. When the villagers heard their own inside jokes reflected in the grand epic, it sent a powerful, unspoken signal. The story walker was not a distant, solemn oracle. They were one of them, someone who had listened closely enough to understand not only their pain, but also their play. This shared laughter dissolved the last remnants of formality, breaking down the invisible barrier between performer and audience. It created a warm, communal atmosphere, a feeling of being among friends. In that open, receptive space, the heavier themes of the story, the warnings and the morals, could land with greater impact because the audience's defenses were down and their hearts were open. The story could now speak to the whole person, not just the solemn part. A story's tempo was never fixed in stone, but was a rhythm pulled directly from the breath of the crowd. The eighth craft of the story walker was this dynamic, real-time control over pacing, a skill born from constant and subtle observation. They were masters of atmosphere, human barometers sensitive to the slightest shifts in the collective mood. Imagine a performance for farmers at dusk, their bodies weary from a full day of labor in the fields. A fast-paced, frantic tale of adventure would feel like an assault, an unwelcome demand on their last reserves of energy. For them, the story walker would adopt a slower, more deliberate cadence. They would stretch out descriptive passages, painting the quiet beauty of a starlit forest or the deep silence of an ancient tomb. They would employ long, intentional pauses, letting the weight of a solemn moment settle over the audience like a soft blanket. This measured pacing did not bore them. It respected their exhaustion and gently pulled them into a state of contemplative wonder. Now contrast this with a performance during a vibrant harvest festival. The air is electric with celebration, and the crowd is buzzing with lively energy. The same story, told with a slow and somber rhythm, would fall flat, failing to capture the heightened spirits of the moment. Here, the story walker would become a whirlwind. They would quicken their delivery, launching into action sequences with a rapid-fire intensity that mirrored the crowd's own excitement. The pauses would grow shorter, the sentences more urgent, pulling the audience along on a thrilling, breathless ride. This was not merely a change in speed, it was a profound act of empathy. By matching the story's heartbeat to the audience's own, the story walker ensured the narrative never felt like a foreign artifact being presented to them. Instead, it felt like an organic extension of their own collective emotion, a tale that breathed in sync with them. A slow, building suspense could make a tired group lean forward, their fatigue forgotten. A sudden, explosive climax could make a festive crowd erupt in a collective cheer. This masterful modulation of tempo transformed a monologue into a dialogue, a performance into a shared experience, proving that the most powerful stories are not just heard, but felt in the very pulse of those who listen. The story's rhythm was always in tune with the turning earth. A story walker knew that the most powerful myths were not just shaped by the people, but by the very seasons that governed their lives. This was their ninth craft, the seamless integration of narrative with the agricultural and celestial cycles. The same legend of a dying and reborn god was not a fixed text, it was a living thing that changed with the landscape. In the vibrant, urgent days of spring, when seeds were pressed into the warming soil, the story would emphasize themes of promise, potential, and the courageous leap of faith required for new growth. The hero's journey would mirror the farmer's own, a narrative of hope planted against uncertainty. But when that same story walker returned in the deep autumn, with the fields lying bare and the air growing cold, the very same myth would pivot. Now the focus would fall heavily on sacrifice, on the necessity of death for the promise of future renewal. The god's descent into the underworld was no longer a distant tragedy. It was the chilling wind that stripped the leaves from the trees, a necessary step in a grand, eternal pattern. This deliberate alignment did something profound. It wrapped the often harsh and unpredictable realities of farming life in a cloak of cosmic meaning. A failed harvest was not just a random disaster, it was part of a larger, divine struggle they understood from the stories. The first spring blossom was not just a relief, it was the victory of the light hero over the dark giant, played out in their very fields. The myths became a way to process the world, to see their own labor, their anxieties, and their celebrations as integral threads in the fabric of the universe. The story told under the harvest moon was as essential as the stored grain, a different kind of sustenance for the long winter ahead. It reinforced a sacred truth that their lives and the legends were not separate, but two expressions of the same eternal cycle. The very act of choosing a story was a performance in itself. A story walker never simply pulled a tale from their bag like a common merchant. They presented themselves as a conduit, a humble vessel through which the correct narrative could flow into the community. Before a single word of the legend was spoken, a subtle ritual of selection would unfold. The narrator might stand quietly for a long moment, seeming to listen to the whispers in the leaves, consulting a direction the wind blew from. They might gaze into the heart of the communal fire, interpreting the dance of the flames as a sign from the story spirits. Often, they would turn to the village elders, asking with genuine gravity which hunger needed to be fed, which question from the past was begging for an answer. Was it a time for a story of courage or one of caution, a tale of creation or one of forgiveness? This ceremonial process did something magnificent. It elevated the entire event from a simple recitation to a meaningful, even sacred occasion. The audience was no longer passive. They were participants in the choosing, their silent hopes and unspoken anxieties felt and acknowledged in the ritual. This crafted offering gave them a profound sense of agency and destiny. The story that was finally told did not feel random. It felt destined, a specific piece of wisdom carefully selected for their ears alone at that precise crossroads in their collective life. By framing the narrative as a gift bestowed rather than a service rendered, the story walker transformed its perceived value entirely. It was no longer entertainment, it was an answer. It was no longer a story, it was a key. This reverence for the tale's origin made the community lean in, their hearts and minds wide open, ready to receive the message not as fiction, but as truth meant just for them. The story did not truly live until the audience gave it their breath. An 11th craft transformed the listeners from a passive crowd into a chorus of co-creators through the deliberate magic of call and response. A story walker would pause at a crucial moment, their voice rising with a question or a declaration meant for all. What sound does the giant's heart make? They might roar, and the children would respond by pounding their feet on the ground in a thunderous rhythm. Or as the hero stood before a magical gate, the narrator would shout the first half of an ancient protective charm, and the entire village, from the elders to the youngest, would answer with the second half in a single, unified voice. This was far more than a simple trick to maintain attention. It was a deliberate weaving of the community's collective energy directly into the fabric of the tale. The line between the one telling the story and those hearing it completely dissolved. Everyone became a participant, a vital actor in the unfolding drama. A story heard is a memory. A story you help to tell with your own voice and your own hands becomes an experience etched into your very being. The narrative was no longer the sole property of the traveler. It became a shared possession, a communal event that belonged to the village as much as its harvest or its history. This collective act of imagination generated a unique, crackling energy, a feeling that the story was happening not just in front of them, but through them, ensuring its message was not just understood, but embodied by every single person present. A story told is a fleeting thing, a whisper on the wind, but a story you can hold in your hand becomes a part of the world. This was the wisdom behind the 12th craft, the strategic use of props and local artifacts as narrative anchors. A story walker's bag was not filled with generic trinkets. Instead, it contained, or they would find, objects that were already steeped in the village's own life. That oddly smooth, dark stone a child might skip across the river was not just a rock. In the storyteller's hand, it became the petrified heart of the mountain giant, still faintly warm to the touch. A scrap of brilliantly dyed cloth gifted by the local weaver could be held aloft as a fragment of the legendary cloak of invisibility, lost in an ancient battle. This was a genius act of alchemy. The story walker was taking the ordinary, the familiar, the very stuff of their daily existence, and infusing it with epic significance. By weaving these local artifacts directly into the narrative, they created an unbreakable bond between the fantastical legend and the tactile reality of the village. The story was no longer just a series of words. It now had a physical presence. These objects became powerful mnemonic devices, tangible souvenirs of the tale. Long after the story walker had moved on, the villagers would see that stone by the river and remember the giant's sorrow. They would see that type of cloth in the weaver's shop and recall the hero's clever escape. The myth had literally taken root in their environment, its symbols woven into the fabric of their lives. This craft ensured the story's message endured, anchored not just in memory, but in the very soil and objects the community touched every day, a constant, quiet reminder of the magic that lived just beneath the surface of their world. A truly great story needs a monster you can believe in, a villain born from the shadows of the very world you know. The 13th craft of the story walker was this deliberate act of sculpting antagonists from the community's collective fears and anxieties. This was not about recycling generic monsters from a dusty tome. It was a form of psychological alchemy, transforming the formless dread that haunted the village into a tangible, narrative entity that could be faced, fought, and ultimately defeated. If a community's livestock was being stalked by a pack of wolves, the creature in the legend would not be a distant dragon. It would be a monstrous, cunning beast with glowing eyes and a chilling, familiar howl that echoed from the nearby woods. For a village trembling on the brink of a harsh, uncertain winter, the villain might manifest as a merciless ice spirit, its breath a blizzard that threatened to snuff out their hearths. The story walker was externalizing their deepest, most unspoken worries, giving them a name and a shape. This process offered a profound catharsis. When the hero of the tale finally stood against this personalized embodiment of fear, the entire village stood with them. The collective sigh of relief as the villain was vanquished was not just for the fictional victory. It was a release of their own pent-up anxiety. The abstract, overwhelming threat of starvation or predation was made concrete, and in being conquered within the safe container of the story, it became a threat that the human spirit could, in fact, overcome. This craft provided more than just momentary comfort. It equipped the community with a psychological framework for resilience. By witnessing their fears personified and defeated in myth, they internalized a powerful, subconscious truth. The monsters of the real world, while formidable, were not invincible. They, too, could be faced with courage and cunning. The story became a rehearsal for resilience, a narrative armor forged in the fires of shared imagination, preparing their hearts for the real battles that lay ahead under the cold, indifferent stars. A single myth was never just one story, but a deep well of potential narratives. The story walker knew precisely which bucket to lower, drawing out the version that would quench a specific audience's thirst. This 14th craft was the subtle art of emphasizing entirely different story arcs from within the same legendary framework. The raw material of the epic remained constant, but the central theme, the driving force of the narrative, would pivot with breathtaking precision. For a restless band of young hunters and aspiring warriors, the tale would erupt with the clang of steel. The narrator would magnify every detail of the hero's journey, the grueling training, the strategic brilliance in battle, and the sweet taste of hard-won glory. The very same legend, told later that evening to a circle of mothers and elders, would transform into something entirely different. Now, the focus would shift inward to the quiet moments of sacrifice, the aching worry for those left behind, and the enduring, resilient strength of the family bond that anchored the hero through the storm. This was not a matter of adding or removing scenes, but of changing the story's emotional gravity, pulling a different thread to make an entire new pattern visible. For a joyous wedding feast, the epic became a soaring romance, where the quest was merely the backdrop for a timeless love story. For a community fractured by a crime, the very same characters would serve a narrative laser focused on justice, restitution, and the restoration of moral order. This chameleon-like ability revealed a staggering understanding of both narrative anatomy and the human heart. It guaranteed that the village's foundational myths never grew stale, and more importantly, that every person, regardless of age or role, could find a doorway into the tale that spoke directly to the hopes and questions defining their own life. The story became a multifaceted gem, and the story walker knew exactly how to turn it so that the light would catch in a unique way for every single viewer. A story told only once is a seed that never takes root. In a world without written records, the 15th craft ensured a tale would bloom for generations, using the primal power of melody and rhythm as its soil. The story walker understood that the human mind clings to a song far more fiercely than it does to plain speech. so they wove the narrative's very architecture from sound. A hero's triumphant arrival might be heralded by the same rising musical phrase every single time, a fanfare sung with open arms. A villain's sinister spell could be a low, guttural chant, its words repeating in a hypnotic loop that coiled through the listener's minds. These were not mere decorative flourishes, they were mnemonic anchors, carefully placed hooks for memory. For the story walker, this musical structure was a lifesaver. A complex epic with dozens of characters and twists could be reliably reconstructed night after night by following this internal melodic map. The chant for the river crossing came before the meeting with the oracle, just as the triumphant chorus marked the final battle. The melody was their unshakable script. For the audience, this rhythmic patterning transformed listening from a passive act into an active, almost physical experience. People would find themselves tapping a foot to the rhythm of a journey song, or unconsciously mouthing the words to the repeated protective charm that shielded the hero. When the familiar chorus came around, children would join in, their small voices rising with the crowds. This participation etched the story's key moments into their very being. Long after the fire had died down and the story walker was a day's journey away, the villagers would be humming the tune while mending nets. They would repeat the catchy, rhythmic description of the magical sword while working the forge. The story had infected them, not as a fleeting entertainment, but as a cognitive echo. The melody became the story's soul, and the repetitive phrases became its bones, a durable structure that allowed the community to carry the entire narrative intact within them, ready to be retold and relived long into the future. The most powerful stories refused to stay neatly in their lanes. A story walker's 16th craft was a kind of narrative alchemy, a seamless blending of myth, history, and personal anecdote into a single, intoxicating brew. They would begin a grand epic about a sky god forging the sun, but then pause, grounding the tale by connecting it to the very real history of the village's own founding, perhaps linking the god's hammer to the ancient, revered anvil in the blacksmith's lineage. Just as the audience was absorbing this cosmic connection, the storyteller might slip in a short, self-deprecating story from their own travels, a time they were tricked by a clever ferryman that perfectly mirrored the trickster god's antics in the main plot. This layering of scales was deliberate genius. The verified local history lent the myth a weight of truth, while the myth, in turn, elevated that local history to the level of legend. The personal anecdote, funny and relatable, acted as the bridge, the human-scale proof that the themes of these grand tales were playing out in everyday life, even on a dusty road. This narrative tapestry convinced the listeners that the boundary between the divine and the mundane was not a solid wall, but a shimmering veil. Their own ancestors' struggle to find this valley was not just a family story. It was a continuation of the sun god's first journey. The story walker's own mishap was a tiny echo of a cosmic prank. This craft created a holistic world view where everything was interconnected, where every small personal tale had its place in the grand, unfolding scheme of the universe. A story walker's true power often lay not in what they said, but in what they deliberately chose to leave unsaid. This 17th craft was the ethical practice of omission and discretion, a subtle art of narrative editing that put the community's well-being above rigid fidelity to a text. Not every part of a standard legend was medicine, some parts were poison, and a master narrator knew the difference instantly. If a widely known myth contained a brutal tale of sibling betrayal, and the village was still reeling from a feud that had torn two families apart, the story walker would skillfully excise that entire plot thread. The core of the story remained, but the specific, painful parallel vanished. Similarly, if a heroic figure in the standard version was a notorious drunkard, and the local chieftain was struggling with that very same weakness, the character's flaws would be softened, their vice transformed into a more generic moment of doubt or pride. This was never about deception or censorship for its own sake. It was a profound act of social and emotional intelligence, a protective measure. The story walker's primary goal was to heal, unite, and enlighten, not to recklessly reopen fresh wounds or cause public humiliation. By pruning the narrative of harmful thorns, they ensured the story could function as a balm. This craft required immense sensitivity and respect for the community's fragile emotional state. It proved that the storyteller was not a mere repeater of tales, but a true guardian of the communal spirit, understanding that the highest purpose of a story is not to be accurate, but to be helpful. The legend in their hands was a living thing, pruned with care so it could bear fruit for everyone present, leaving no one behind in its shadow. A story's final word is not always its final thought. In their 18th craft, the story walker mastered the power of the open ending, deliberately leaving certain tales unresolved. They understood that a perfect, sealed conclusion could sometimes close the door on wonder, while a carefully placed question could keep the story living and breathing within the community. So, a legend might not end with the hero's triumphant return, but with the narrator's quiet, lingering query. And so, did the spirit of the forest truly forgive them, or does a trace of that old anger still whisper in the leaves? That is not for me to say, it is for you to decide. Or perhaps a tale of a hidden treasure would conclude with the line, "And the golden cup was never found." Some say it waits even now, not for the strongest or the cleverest, but for the one with the purest heart in this very village. This was not a sign of an incomplete story, it was a brilliant narrative strategy. By refusing to provide all the answers, the story walker handed the final brush to the audience, inviting them to paint the last strokes on the canvas of the tale. This single act of narrative trust transformed the community from consumers into creators. Long after the traveler had moved on, their story remained, but it was no longer a static relic. It became a living spark. It fueled debates among the elders by the fire, each arguing their interpretation of the forest spirit's mood. It inspired children's games in the meadow as they searched for the hidden treasure under every familiar rock. It prompted quiet, personal reflection as a young person wondered, what would a pure heart even look like, and could I ever possess one? The story, by remaining unfinished, became endlessly renewable. It wove itself into the daily life and private dreams of the village, ensuring the story walker's voice was never truly gone, because it had been seamlessly replaced by their own. A story is not just a sound that enters the ears, it is a force that can be felt in the body. The 19th craft of the story walker was this deliberate, full-bodied art of physical performance. Their tool was not merely the voice, but the entire physical self, a living instrument of gesture, posture, and movement. They did not simply describe the lurking horror in the swamp, they became it, crouching low with hunched shoulders, their fingers curling like gnarled roots, their eyes scanning the audience with a predatory stillness. When the tale called for a benevolent sky god bestowing a gift, the story walker would stand to their full height, arms outstretched and palms open, their face tilted upwards as if catching a celestial light. This was not random flailing, it was a calibrated language of the body, often tailored with exquisite care to local customs. A bow of deep respect would be performed with the exact depth and hand placement unique to that village's elders. A gesture to ward off evil spirits might precisely mirror the specific, intricate hand signs used by the local shaman during their rituals. This physical embodiment was a masterstroke of connection. It transformed the telling from a spoken lecture into a breathtaking, one-person theater. The audience did not just hear about the hero's desperate climb up a cliff face. They saw it in the straining muscles of the performers' arms and legs. They felt the vertigo in their own stomachs. A story told with the whole body bypasses the intellectual mind and speaks directly to the primal, physical level of human understanding. It makes the narrative visceral and utterly dynamic, helping everyone, from the smallest child to the most elderly listener, to see the action and connect with the characters in a way that words alone could never, ever achieve. A storywalker's work was never truly finished when they packed their bag and left. Their 20th and perhaps most generous craft was the deliberate act of seeding new variations directly into the village's imagination. They understood that a story left completely unchanged could become as rigid and brittle as an old bone. So, as a final gift, they would plant a single, potent question into the familiar soil of a legend. After recounting the classic tale of the brave weaver who outwitted the moon spirit, they might pause, their voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. In the northern valleys, they say the weaver was not acting alone, but was secretly guided by the spirit of her first loom, a gift from her grandmother. Or perhaps they would hint at an entirely unexplored chapter. The saga of the Twin Kings usually ends with their reconciliation, but beyond the great river, the bards sing of a third, forgotten sibling who chose a life of solitude in the mountains, and some claim his descendants still walk among us. This was not presented as a correction, but as an offering, a narrative fork in the road. By introducing these alternative motives and hidden chapters, the storywalker was gifting the community something priceless: narrative autonomy. They were handing them the keys to the story itself. This act of seeding ensured the myth remained a living, growing entity long after the travelers' footprints had faded from the road. The villagers were no longer just custodians of a fixed tale, they were now its cultivators. Around the evening fire, they could debate the new possibility. Was the weaver's success truly her own, or did it belong to the wisdom of her ancestors embodied in that loom? Did the solitary sibling make the wiser choice? Children would incorporate these new threads into their games, and future local tellers would feel empowered to weave in their own insights. This was the ultimate craft of legacy. It transformed a community of listeners into a community of storytellers, ensuring the tale would not just be repeated, but would evolve, carrying the unique imprint of that specific village forward through the generations. The story was now irrevocably their own. The final and perhaps most poignant craft began only after the last ember of the story had faded to ash. The storywalker understood that their departure was as crucial to the legend as their arrival. They never lingered to collect praise or payment, never allowed the hard, practical questions of where they slept or what they ate to tarnish the magic they had woven. Often, the village would awaken at dawn to find the space by the fire empty, the mysterious traveler gone as silently as a mist. No farewells, no promises of a return, just the profound silence left in the wake of a storm of words. This was not rudeness, it was a final, masterful narrative choice. That deliberate absence was the final brushstroke on the canvas of their myth. It forced the community to look not at the ordinary person who had stood before them, but at the incredible stories now living within them. In the empty space where the storyteller had been, imagination rushed in. Was that hunched old man truly just a wanderer, or had they been visited by a god in disguise, testing their hearts? Was that lively young woman merely a performer, or could she have been the spirit of the river, sharing her own ancient history? By vanishing, the storywalker ensured they remained an eternal question mark, a figure of pure potential. The magic of the tales became inextricably linked to the mystery of the teller. This silent craft prevented the mundane reality of a dusty cloak and tired feet from ever eclipsing the sublime wonder of the epic. It guaranteed that their memory would be polished like a sacred stone over the long months and years, and that their next appearance on the horizon would be met not with casual familiarity, but with a collective, breathless anticipation, a feeling that a piece of the mythic world was about to step once more into their own. These 21 crafts of the story walker reveal a profound and enduring truth. The most powerful stories are not those simply recited, but those lovingly customized, transforming a universal tale into a living, breathing part of the community that hears it. From the silent art of deep listening to the strategic weaving of local landmarks, from the careful tailoring of a moral to the full-bodied physicality of performance, each craft was a deliberate step toward a single, magnificent goal. It was the creation of a shared, immersive experience where the line between myth and reality blurred, where the audience did not just hear a story, they stepped inside it. This ancient, human-centric approach stands in stark contrast to our modern world of algorithm-driven content, where stories are so often broadcast to the many, with little regard for the one. The story walker's methods remind us of the irreplaceable value of genuine human connection, of deep empathy, and of the bespoke narrative crafted not for clicks but for hearts. Their legacy is a challenge to us all. Let us carry their spirit forward, striving to make our own stories, whether in quiet conversation, in our business, or in our art, as resonant, as personal, and as deeply meaningful as theirs were. If this journey into the art of the customized legend has sparked a new thought or an old memory, we would love to hear from you. Share your reflections in the comments below, and subscribe to continue exploring the timeless power of myth together.